Hi everybody, welcome to the Renaissance Woodworker. I'm your host Shannon Rogers, and we're going out in the field a little bit today. So you've built your share of projects. You've used your homesteader lumber, you've struggled through the warp, bow, and twist of poorly dried poplar or not dried poplar, red oak, maybe some maple, occasionally some alder, and you're ready to get some real lumber. Enough! No more of this crappy lumber. Take me to a lumber yard and get me the real stuff. Well, here's where things start to fall apart. The average woodworker is suddenly confronted and daunted by a whole slate of terminology, by different species, and a heck of a lot of species. I'm here at the J. Gibson McIlvaine Lumber Yard, where I spend my days, and if you look around behind me, you'll see enormous sheds full of lumber, stacked 30 feet high. If you come to one of these lumber yards and you say, hey, I'm looking for 13 board feet of cherry, what they'll do is walk you over to the cherry stacks and they'll point to some FAS cherry or some common cherry, and this is what you're looking at. 30 feet high stack of cherry, and you have to pick out what you want. Can you necessarily go through all these stacks and really pull out each board? Probably not. Now imagine if you don't necessarily know what you're talking about and they start asking you, what grade, what thickness, do you need it kiln dried, air dried, green? Then imagine you're looking for a more exotic. Say you're looking for mahogany. Suddenly now they're asking you, do you want FSC? What region do you want it from? Now it's a whole new equation and a whole new slate of variables. Imagine trying to pick out the mahogany for a lowboy from inside the mahogany shed at a wholesaler like McIlvaine. Here I have row after row of mahogany stacked to the ceiling, 30, 40, 50 feet high, row upon row of a 500-foot long building that's probably about 60 feet wide. The mahogany comes from all over South America, from Central America, even from the South Pacific and Fiji. And trying to determine what mahogany is going to be just right for you can be really, really daunting. So all this lumber that you see around me is really not indicative of your typical retail lumber yard. Wholesalers can be a good source for the furniture maker, custom furniture maker, but generally you need to buy in volumes that are 500, even 1,000 board feet. And when you start dealing in volumes like that, you got to be able to drive a forklift in order to get the material off the stack. The typical woodworker is going to be going and looking through the boards piece by piece. It's more likely that you'll be buying your lumber from a typical retail lumber yard, one that stacks their lumber so that you can get to it, whether it's horizontally or in vertical racks. This is Hardwood to Go. It's our online retail partner. I admit it's a bit of a mess right now because a bunch of new material arrived and I haven't even gotten inventorying it yet. But at least here you can move the boards around and pick out what you want. And it's here that I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the lumber industry lingo and terminology and a little bit about lumber grading. I can test that if you know this terminology and you know about grading, it's going to help you in your next trip to the lumber yard and help you plan out how to buy your wood for your next project. I think lumber thickness confuses a lot of people, and it's sold in quarters, 4-quarter, 6-quarter, 8-quarter, etc. This is a relic of how the sawmills used to saw up the lumber. The saw blade itself had a series of set notches or detents that were 1/4 inch apart. If you wanted a 1-inch thick piece like we have here, you clicked it over 4 clicks and you got 4-quarter. You wanted a 2-inch piece, you clicked it over 8 clicks and you had an 8-quarter piece, etc., etc. Click it over 12 clicks and you've got a 12-quarter piece. They do essentially break down to 4/4 an inch, so 4/4 is an inch material. These days the sawmills have gotten a little bit more sophisticated and they have a little bit more fine-tunability to them, but the lumber terminology still remains. For the most part, when you're buying 4/4 material, it's going to be 1 inch thick. The good sawmills will make it actually a little bit heavier than that, so it can be 1 to 1 1/8 inches thick, and likewise for 8/4 and 12/4. The truth of the matter is finding material thicker than 8/4 is going to be a little bit more difficult because it's a lot harder to dry properly in those thick amounts. It takes a lot longer. More drying defects are going to be a lot more apparent. Second of all, the commercial market or the demand for lumber thicker than 8/4 really isn't all that high. So it's difficult for a retailer to actually move a large amount of material in 12 and 16/4 thicknesses. If your local retailer sells these thicknesses, you've got a good retailer, but you might have to look a little bit to find just the right species you want in those thicker sizes. So keep that in mind. You can't necessarily design everything around 16/4 stock. 4/4 and 8/4 pretty much going to be available at most decent lumber yards. Board footage. Lumber is sold in volumetric units. A board foot is a unit of volume. Essentially, a board foot is equal to 1 inch thick by 12 inches wide by 12 inches long. So how does this translate down to you buying your projects? It can be really confusing for a lot of people. There are some great calculators online. In fact, there's even an outstanding app called the Woodshop app for iOS and Android phones. There's also a web page version of this as well that will help you calculate the board footage. It's also going to give you a lot of other useful information. For me, it doesn't help me that much when I need to calculate board foot on the fly. I find that thinking of it in terms of percentages of 12 will help you a lot. Let me give you an example. This is a 4/4 by 6 by 6 foot long piece of quarter sawn cherry. It's 4/4, so it's already 1 inch thick. We can eliminate that from the equation here. It's 6 inches wide. 6 is 50% of 12. So for every single linear foot of length, we have a half a board foot. So this is a 6 foot long board, therefore it's 3 board feet for this entire board. Half, or 6 inches, which is 50% of 12, times 6 is 3 board feet. Here is an 8/4 piece of walnut. This is actually a little bit heavy of 8 inches, but just for calculation purposes, we'll round it down to 8 inches. It's 8/4 by 8 by, I guess this is probably 5 feet. So obviously it's 8/4, so that adds a little bit to the equation here. 8 is 2/3 or 66% of 12. So for every linear foot of length, we're going to have, what is that? 1.6 board feet. So 1.6 times 5 will give you your total board footage. So we're looking at about 7 board feet right here. Here's an easy one. This piece of sapele is 4/4 by 24 by 9 feet long. For every 1 foot of distance, we have 2 board feet. It's 9 feet long, so this is 18 board feet for this 24 inch wide monster. Calculating board feet will help you, especially if you're working off a plan that tells you you need X amount of board feet. However, just assuming that my plan says 20 board feet and I'll be all set isn't going to get you there. Going to the lumberyard and saying I need 20 board feet of cherry or walnut or zebra wood isn't necessarily going to get you the exact lumber you want. You need to understand how grades work and what you're going to use those pieces for. So when you go to the lumberyard, you need to have a good idea of how you're going to use the lumber and where. Asking questions of your dealer is going to be helpful, but you have to know the answers because they're liable to ask questions back on how you plan to use this 24 inch wide piece of sapele. Lumber grades aren't terribly standardized and they are a bit antiquated. The National Hardwood Lumber Association, or NHLA, put together its first group of standards in the late 1800s, and the terms first and second, or FAS, select, and number 1, 2, and 3 common have pretty much stuck since then. There have been kind of nuances that have sprung up over the years, like furniture grade or luthier grade, and some lumber yards use them and some don't. It's going to be highly possible that when you go to your local lumber yard, they may have their own way of determining really, really high quality or even lower quality lumber. But ultimately, it all falls back on FAS, Select, or sometimes you hear Select and Better, or SAB, and the number 1, 2, and 3 common grades. Technically, these grades don't apply to the exotic species, but it does get used from time to time. You will see lumber yards that carry FAS Mahogany or Select Sapele. The reality is that most of these tropical species have very little sapwood and are usually very free of defects because they grow very dense and very large. So it's very, very easy to meet FAS grade. So most of the time, the exotics you're going to see are already FAS or better. Now, I'm not expecting every woodworker to become a lumber grading expert, but having a general idea of what is required to meet these grades will really help you speak with your lumber dealer a lot better, but also really help you determine what pieces you're going to need for your project. First and second, our FAS lumber says that the board must be at minimum 6 inches wide and 8 feet long. It has to be 83.3% clear of defects. Defects can be things like knots or wane. Defects do not include sapwood. Now, in order for it to be FAS, not only does it have to be 83.3% clear of defects, but you have to be able to get clear cuttings out of it. And those clear cuttings to meet FAS are 4 inches wide by 5 feet long, or 3 inches wide by 7 feet long. So knowing those grades will pretty much be able to help you determine if I need a board that's 4 inches wide and 6 feet long. An FAS board will guarantee me that I can get that clear cutting. Select is basically the exact same thing as FAS, but it only has to meet those criteria on one face of the board. So this face of walnut is definitely 6 inches wide by 8 feet long, and I can absolutely get clear cuttings out of this, and it's 83% clear of defects. However, on the other face, I've got a significant amount of wane at the bottom, I've got a big knot at the top, and a huge knot right here in the middle. I may have a hard time getting those FAS clear cuttings out of this board. I might be able to get them, but more than likely this would be classified as a select board. Great on one face, not so great on the other face. Great board and a little bit of cost savings when you're talking about cabinetry where no one's going to see the inside. Common boards is when you start to get into some of the shorter boards that have a little bit more defects. Number 1 common requires that 66.6% of the board be clear of defects. The board must be 3 inches wide by 4 foot long at a minimum, and your clear cuttings must be 4 inches by 2 feet or 3 inches by 3 feet long. Moving down to a number 2 or number 3 common, which unfortunately I don't have an example here, it goes down to 50% clear of defects, and the clear cuttings shrink down even more. It's still the same minimum board size, but ultimately you're running into smaller and smaller space that's going to be clear of defects. Now the good news is, for the average woodworker, the average furniture maker, we're making parts that are really quite small. You can get any number of rail styles and rails that are 1.5 to 2 inches wide out of a common board. The thing you need to think about is what kind of color match, and also a lot of times the sapwood tends to get lumped into the common. Even though NHLA does not discount sap as a defect, a lot of modern design aesthetics do say that sapwood is a defect. So many graders will grade it as a defect, even though technically it's not. So keep that in mind. You can save a significant amount of money by buying number 1, number 2, and number 3 common. But I think you'll also find that most of your dealers are going to have FAS material. If your lumber dealer is a sawmill that saws all its own stock, they're going to have a much higher percentage of common boards because they're sawing the whole log and they're doing something with the whole log. If your dealer does not have a sawmill and buys their lumber from a wholesaler like J. Gibson McIlvaine, they tend to only buy FAS. The common material is so low in cost and price that it's difficult to make any kind of profit on it when you're having to buy it from another middleman. For that matter, when it comes to exotics, as I said earlier, it's very rare that you will find common material. Most of the time, common teak or sapele never even makes it on the boat to cross the ocean in the first place. So recognize that when you go to your lumber dealer, whether they saw their own material or not, the majority of the stock available will probably be FAS or Select and better, just because this is what the market demands. Being able to save money on common is a nice feature, but you might actually find that it's harder to get that than you would think unless you go to an actual sawmill. So here's the thing. You've got the project you want to build, you're ready to go buy lumber. You really need to have both a plan A and a plan B. What would be your ideal situation if you're making a large table? Could you make it in 1 or 2 pieces? Can you get 12 or 15 inch wide stock? You don't really know, but that would be your perfect world to be able to get that wide stock. Plan B would be relying upon your knowledge of the grades, knowing that FAS lumber is at least 6 inches wide, and you ought to be able to get usually 8 inches. Most of the lumber you'll find in FAS is 6 to 8 inches wide. So you can fall back on that and say, okay, if my tabletop is 24 inches across and I were to buy 4 FAS boards, I ought to be able to make up the top. So that's your plan B. You want to work out a parts list with plan A being the perfect ideal world and plan B falling back on your knowledge of the minimum clear cuttings required per grade and knowing that your lumber dealer generally will have a large amount of FAS. You can build that plan B. Then you can walk into the lumber yard knowing how many boards of FAS material you're going to need, and you can look out for those beautiful wide boards or specifically figured boards that you need to make that plan A work. If you find those, you can eliminate some of that traditional FAS material from plan B and go from there. Let me give you an example. I just started the construction of a dining table, and I'm actually videoing the whole thing. I'm going to build all of the substructure out of just some 4x4 Douglas fir from Home Depot. I'm going to end up painting that all black, but I really want to highlight the top and make that just the star of the show. So I'm going to build it out of cherry. My tabletop is 6 feet long and 32 inches wide. So, what are the chances of me finding one slab to do that? Next to none. Even if I do, it's going to be really expensive. So can I do a 2-board top? That would require me to have like 17 or 18 inch wide boards. That would, I guess, be my plan A. And I could grab something like this wide, 18 inch wide board. Now, finding 18 inch wide material in cherry, you'll quickly discover, is next to impossible. The tree just doesn't grow that big anymore, and it might have been a little over harvested from when it did grow that way. Traditionally, 12 inch wide cherry is about as wide as you can find now. So I know that my plan A probably won't include super wide boards. However, if I can get 12 inch wide boards, I could use 3 or 4 of those to make my tabletop. I really would need 4, and I end up cutting one of those boards down kind of narrow. And even no matter how hard I work to make those glue lines invisible, it'll look off. It won't look symmetrical. So ultimately, I should actually go with a more even spacing of boards. If I've got 32 inches across and I take 4 8-inch wide boards, that's going to give me 32 inches. Now, once I mill that and surface it, I might end up a little scant of that. So what I want to do is look for some boards that are 8 plus, a little heavy on that. And you can still find that in the same price point. Generally, the prices start to go up when you get above 9 inches wide. So my plan A would be really, really super wide boards. Plan B, relying upon my knowledge of 6 to 8 inches wide, tells me that I need to get at least 6 6-inch wide boards to make my tabletop. I'm going to have to do some trimming, but I could still get a symmetrical top there. If I go in looking for 8.5 to 9-inch wide boards, I can get away with only 4 pieces for my top. It'll probably look more contiguous, more homogeneous, and a little bit more pleasing. I'm going to put breadboards on the end of this. Traditionally, I don't want my breadboards to stand out. In fact, I'll show you the stocking I'm going to use is some nice quarter sawn curly cherry, really beautiful figure. I don't want to use curly material for the breadboards because that will actually distract a little bit from the beautiful figure on the top. So I want to grab a really straight grain material, and I know that my breadboards are 4 inches wide and they only need to be about 35 inches long. So I could probably get away with a #1 common material, or certainly on both the top and the breadboards, some select material, because the only way you're going to see the underside is if you crawl underneath it. So knowing how the grades work and the minimum cuttings that you get from them tells you how to build your plan A and plan B. Now let's be honest, woodworkers embrace defects. So if you find a board with a knot in it, that may look great right in the middle of your tabletop, and you might be able to come up with a significant savings if that board does not meet those FAS guidelines. So understand your lumber grades. It will help you build your parts list. It will help you speak the language of your lumber dealer, and ultimately help you be prepared to know exactly what boards you need to get in both Plan A and Plan B. I hope this helps. Ultimately, understand wood is an organic material. It's going to be different from tree to tree, from pallet to pallet, from lumber yard to lumber yard. These grades are a guideline. I'm not saying that every single lumber yard is going to follow these. In fact, probably the rule will be that every lumber yard does not follow them. But you can generally fall back on these standard FAS, select, and common grades to know what kind of sizes you can anticipate from your lumber dealer. Hope it helped. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.
In the basement room that day, poking fun and making jokes for getting on their knees.